together to make us aware of where we came and where we're going. You remember that we have taken up several classes already. By the way, can you hear me? Can you see on the screen?
Yes,
Clear?
Father.
Yes.
Loud and clear,
Yes, Father.
crystal clear.
Father.
Yes, Father.
Crystal clear. It must be my cold that makes it crystal clear. Okay. So we have taken up the idea of ministry as it has developed through the years, and well, we say through the centuries, really. When we going back to the New Testament and to the early times of the fathers, we find certain things that have actually, what they call this, continued on, except that the focus and the emphasis shifted had shifted. And because of the shift of the focus and the emphasis, then the idea of ministry has also changed a little bit. So we need to understand that for any change in ministry, whether it was a change in the past or a change that we would like to introduce in the future, one of the most important considerations to be to be noted is the fact that our idea of ministry depends largely on the ecclesiological framework that we use. In other words, how we look at the church. That view of the church is going to determine exactly what are the main points, who is going to be considered as minister, and would eventually be justified on why particularly that person would be given the kind of ministry. Okay, in other words, ecclesiological framework, uh, what is this, affecting the person who would be chosen as minister, and then of course how that can be actualized in a particular uh, historical age. And you have already seen that different peoples or different types of ministry have different justifications. Oops, I'm trying to get justification for understanding, for a particular understanding of theology. So, for example, among the early Christians, the time of the apostles, and even
Ward,
maybe,
pasok ka na ha.
okay, all right, nakapasok na ba siya? Okay,
Opo.
all right. Pwede nang i-kuan, i-mute yung audio. Okay, the ecclesiological framework of the early Christians was as a community of disciples of Jesus. You remember that they were still very, very close to the experience of Jesus, relatively close to the experience of Jesus. But at a certain point in their life as community of disciples, they experienced persecutions and difficulties. And so there arose what we would call the martyrs or the witnesses or the prophets, who were the preeminent people who would embody in their own persons the ideals of a community of the disciples of Jesus. But side by side with this was already the idea of a church that was still not part of the Roman Empire, but gradually becoming more and more a part of the Roman Empire, precisely because of the growing population. More and more people were becoming part of the church. And so necessarily the Roman authorities or the Roman Empire had to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, eventually the majority, if not all of the Roman Empire would be receiving this particular inspiration, religious inspiration, in the name of Jesus Christ. Okay. So within this framework, we're really talking here about 400, 500 years. Within this framework, then we can understand who would be the chosen ministers. They had episcopoi, they had the presbyteroi, they had the diaconoi. These are the bishops, the presbyters, and the deacons. They were the principal ministers. Okay. But of course, we cannot also say that the martyrs and the prophets were also ministers in their own right, because just by the sheer example of their martyrdom, they were people who were looked up to by others, and precisely that particular made them a veritable witness, a veritable minister of the message of Jesus. Eventually, of course, this group of the presbyteroi, which was basically the council of elders, had become part of the what we would call the threefold structure in the church: the episcopoi, presbyteroi, diaconoi, the bishop, the priest, and the deacons, in a kind of an ordered manner, ordered organization. So there was also tendency among some fathers of the church to look at the role of the bishops as more than just simply the leader of a particular community. Let's say the leader in Corinth, the leader in Athens, the leader in Rome, the leader in Jerusalem. No, he was something more, especially when we talk about these leaders in the context of the Roman Empire. In other words, away from the experience in the Palestine area, in Jerusalem and the environs. They were experiencing something that was pretty much the organizational structure of their locality, a kind of someone who is a big head, a chief perhaps, and invested with a kind of power that is almost not total, but I think it's a dominant power. From this perspective would grow what we now call the monarchical bishops or the monarchical episcopacy, the idea of bishops being not just a church leader, but eventually going to be a leader for the community, including perhaps some of the those maybe who would not be Christians, precisely because of their skills, their leadership skills, their abilities, and their personalities. And great figures during this time precisely came up to become not just church leaders, but also civil leaders. Now, how did they become ministers? Why were they considered ministers? It was the community at first who chose who would be the leaders. They had a great say. Okay, this one person is going to be a leader. And if the leader doesn't prove to be the right person, then they change. There's no worry about that. Okay. Eventually, the leaders in society, especially when we talk about the second and the third century, the prominent people who had in civil society who have converted to Christianity, eventually they were given the task of leading also the church. So they were the leaders in society. And in order to, in a way, solemnize this particular responsibility, the assumption of this responsibility, there was this ritual that was called the laying on of hands, and what they call based on apostolic succession. In other words, there were some people, of course, who were being on whom hands were laid, meaning that they have become leaders in the community. But they were also not teaching properly. So people were asking, on what authority are you going to teach? If you teach simply by your own authority, then maybe that's not good enough. But if you teach by the authority of the apostles, then you are orthodox. Then you are a rightful minister, and you are a successor of the apostles. But as I said, not just by community choice, but ministers were also regarded as such because of certain charisms that they have received from the Spirit. Okay, and this was something that was very much appreciated by the early Christians. So, charismatic kind of a community. So, not just ordination, but also the the idea that you have a very obvious charism. A healer, for example, is someone who is very obvious. Not everybody is given that kind of a gift. So, in a way, the healer becomes a minister in his own way. When we move towards the Middle Ages, we find that the church-state relationship has become almost, identified with each other. It's almost like the two sides of a palm of a hand. The church on one side and the state on the other side. And especially when you talk about good emperors and good popes or good bishops, well, if they're able to agree, then they're able to promote Christendom. They're able to promote the culture of Europe at that time. So there were the Pope, the bishops, and the priests, and also the monks, because during the early part of the Middle Ages, when there was really this almost for forfeiture of education, it was the monks who took over and started again the re-education for the Roman Empire. So in a way, they were already also considered leaders, and they were even given the authority to do things that we nowadays, of course, we would only attribute to the power of the priests. For example, the spiritual direction, or even hearing the confession of some people, they were given to monks. And even if the monks were not ordained priests, they were able to perform those things, those so called sacraments. Okay, but more and more now, with the church state relationship being cemented, okay, there has to be a much more elaborate kind of a ritual in order to signal, in order to mark that this person has been specially chosen to do this kind of job. If there was an enthronement for the emperor, there should be a kind of an enthronement also, or of a ritual or an installation for, let's say, the pope or even the local bishop. That has to be done because it is part of the uh, the uh, the whole idea of giving the office itself the seriousness that the office deserves. Okay, Julius, you turn off mo na. Okay. Ordination. So there was the develop the ordination ritual. It was almost like side by side with the ritual for the enthronement of the kings. Okay. And very likely, the kings were crowned by the Pope, and it was always a great honor for the king to be anointed by the Pope, or to be crowned by the king by the Pope, because that meant that they were being approved by God, because the Pope at that time, of course, became eventually representative of Christ here on earth. So that is what we actually experienced in the Middle Ages. It was this church-state relationship. But again, focus on the idea of ministers. You now have some people who are properly called ministers, and the rest of the people are not ministers. Okay, so you have already the beginning of the onset of the distinction between the ordained and those who are not ordained. And only the ordained were considered ministers. Okay. If you are not ordained, then maybe you have a particular gift. For example, if you were Thomas Aquinas, you were ordained. Of course, you have the right to teach. But aside from that, he's a theologian. It probably is a kind of a gift to be a teacher. It's a kind of a gift. Okay, that is considered. But that is when they were talking about ministers in the High Middle Ages, especially, they were referring simply to the power holders. So now ministers are not only ministers, leaders in the church, leaders in whatever liturgical gathering, liturgical assemblies, but also leaders who not only have power over people, but also probably have properties. They own lands because, well, maybe people were generous and they gave them to the church, and then the one administering is the pope. And of course, just for practical purposes, where will the bishops and the popes get some money to run their dioceses? Of course, it's through the lands that were given to them. Perhaps in all honesty, they were given to them by the emperor precisely because the bishops needed to survive. And when you have a land and a property, you can depend on it for your livelihood, at least for your regular income, monthly income. All right. So, but of course, this one became so focused on the few people who are called the ministers, and that the majority of the church community have been relegated to almost like a secondary, if not a tertiary level. Okay. And this is the situation that faced the reformers. The reformers noticed a great deal of abuses. The bishops and some popes have become very much, like the secular rulers. Not only were they spiritual leaders, but they were also civil leaders, and sometimes copying the actuations of the civil leaders in their corruption and their profligacy and everything that is wrong. And so that is what confronted the reformers, and they wanted a reform of the church. And the reformers said, we need to go back to what we find in the scriptures. When we would like to reform the church, go back to the model that we would find, that we found in the scriptures, in the Bible, the early Christians, and then go back to it. Of course, it was very difficult for the established institutional church to go back to that, because that means losing some power, losing some property, and the influence would be so much more. The church had become such an institution, such a hierarchical institution, that it is not easy to change or to remove it. So the best way to do it is simply just insist that this is the institution, the organization, the hierarchical organization that has been willed by God through time. And so that is the kind of justification that was used, and we will be discussing this a bit more when we talk about the post Tridentine idea of ministry. So the reformers wanted to go back to the New Testament model of the Christian community, so that the choice for leaders would be made by the community. Some even tried to go back to the presbyteral format or organization that they had, with the council of elders advising the bishop, and then of course you have the deacons. They wanted to go back to that kind of a situation, and they were called now Presbyterians, and that's the reason why they but they say that that is their way of looking at ministry, with a great deal of emphasis on pastoral involvement. In other words, you have to be in touch with your people and to be able to guide them and to direct them. Because at this point, the leaders, the priests, the bishops have become so far apart from the people, have become so isolated, and that's why sacerdotalization was the term used for it. They were set aside. They were set aside for a particular state of life, which is the state of life of now the ordained. Okay, so we have gone so far up to this point, the reformers. What we now will be taking up would be, what is going to be the response of Trent to the ideas of the reformers, especially in regard to church, in regard to ministry. Then later on, how is it going to be developed from, let's say, the Council of Trent in 1565? It's the end of the Council of Trent, 1565, up to our own times. Maybe not really up to, maybe just before or after the First Vatican Council. That could be the kind of so that we're really dealing with the about 300, 400 years of development here. Okay, so this is where we speak about the third part of chapter 4, which is on ministry as cult. You already have noticed that Bernier, when he starts talking about the developments of the idea of ministry, he had categorized each kind of development. The emphasis was much more on the cultic part of ministry. His subtitle was The Fortress Church, 1565 to 1962. So if ministry was going to concentrate on the cultic part of priesthood, it is because their ecclesiological framework is that of a fortress church, a church that is being attacked by the reformers, by the Protestants, and by other movements. For example, rationalism, secularism will be coming soon, and even some atheism. So this is the church that is going to fight, first of all, to defend its own ideas, its own organizational setup, and even if perhaps there is some validity to the objections of the reformers. So, kind of an overview, just overview about this Council of Trent. We need to underscore the fact that the call for reform was made, yes, by the Protestant reformers, but also by some groups within the Catholic Church. I don't know if you can go, you remember, but you can go back to Francis of Assisi, because his was already an idea to reform the church. Catherine of Siena was also advocating reform. That's the reason why she was asking for the Pope to go back from Avignon to Rome, because precisely there has to be the normal, what we call the normal, the regular way of conducting church affairs in the center of Christendom, which was in Rome. Now, what happened, of course, in the Council of Trent, before the Council and after the Council of Trent, was that the conflict between the two sides was so polemical that instead of clarifying issues, they hardened their own partisanship, each one trying to dig in and say, this is the right way of interpreting the scriptures, this is the right way of interpreting tradition, this is the right way of celebrating the sacrament, this is the right way of understanding the church, etc. So they were really not meeting head on. They were not dialoguing. They were simply insisting that they were right. But if you look at the theological positions, they really differed more because they had different approaches to some common things, different approaches, and an emphasis, rather than what we would call the fundamental or the doctrinal uh, ideas. In other words, it was simply, for example, interpretation of the Mass. What is the Mass? The Protestants would give more, would put less emphasis on the sacrificial part of the Mass, because the sacrificial part of the Mass moves us into the idea of a ministry as cultic. So, in other words, the idea of ministry would be much more all encompassing. You have a kind of a cultic part, but that's not everything. So, the Catholic Church, they had to insist on the sacrificial part of the Mass precisely because the Mass is an act that only an ordained priest can do. And he does it in the name of Jesus. In the name of Jesus, and what Jesus had done was, of course, offer his own life as a sacrifice for the people. So that is why it's important to stick to sacrifice. But they're actually found in both traditions, just a matter of emphasis. Of course, there are certain things that are a little bit much more much deeply theological, but those are things really that can be ironed out easily. Okay, the sessions, well, just for the sake of the first year, we'll have them taken up church history. I don't know whether you have taken this already. Maybe are you taking church history this year, the first year, this semester? Are you taking church history?
Yes, Father.
So you are now in what? In
Second.
Middle Ages, or yeah, you're now in the Middle Ages, right?
Reformation, Father.
Or Reformation already? Oh, very fast. Okay. So the so what I am offering here would be a kind of a review for you. All right, the sessions of the Council of Trent, they were really they were held in different times, from 1545 to 1563. Sometimes people say 1565. Okay, but just imagine it's almost 20 years, off and on, because of so many things. It was a very volatile kind of an age that you just cannot, you didn't have the luxury to just come and sit down and just talk for whatever, for 2 years straight and then able to discuss everything. It was probably better that way because then you get feedback from other people. Achievements of Council of Trent, wide-ranging institutional reform of the church. If there's anything that we can credit the Council of Trent, it had reformed the church. Not completely, but at least something had been done. Okay. There was doctrinal unity, particularly in addressing the threat of the reformers. So any kind of opposition to the doctrine. Okay, somebody's echoing me.
Đặt có gọi tầm 200
Okay, Pambanki, turn off. Okay, so there was the doctrinal unity was assured by the idea of uniformity. We only have one theology. And it's a one theology that is against the reformers. Basically, that kind of a theology. So a kind of a negative theology. Eventually, of course, what is going to take place will be what they would call controversial theology. Not controversial in a sense that it is, too liberal or too progressive or whatever, but controversial in the sense that it has to do with controversies. You're trying to answer the questions of the other side. Eventually, that's going to develop into what is called the apologetical theology. Some drawbacks on the Council of Trent. There was always this around the mentality of we are offering you a remedy to the crisis that is besetting the whole church. So the reforms of the Council of Trent is a way of remedying the difficult situation that were addressed by the reformers. So internal criticism, within the Roman Catholic Church, even though legitimate, was softened, if not set aside, because accepting it would favor the side of the reformers. If you are not with us, you probably will be against us. So if you start questioning already some of the teachings of the theologians in the Roman Catholic Church, then all the more, the reformers would be very happy because you are a divided church. Therefore, their ideas would probably prevail. Okay. Because the need also was to defend against the reformers' criticism. This was the uppermost in their minds. Theology was not as balanced as it could have been. Balance in a sense that you weigh all the options, you weigh all the different ideas, and then you come up with what is the most suitable way of expressing yourself. If you are pressured from outside, what are you going to do? What you're going to do is to defend yourself. And defend yourself. You don't worry about other things. Sometimes you worry about eating. You don't worry about taking care of your health. You're simply going to defend from the aggression that is coming from outside. Okay. What are the principal theological positions that we find in the Council of Trent? This is a very, very general summary of theological positions. It was basically, of course, the position that refuted the three solas of the Protestantism. So, for example, against sola fides of Luther. Of course, Luther was saying that you can only be saved by faith. What he was trying to emphasize was that it's God who saves, and all you need to do is to accept that God is the one who saved us. That's basically what he was trying to say. Now, the counter-reformers, Council of Trent, would say, you are justified by faith and by works. In other words, what you do contribute also to your justification. But of course, we are not disagreeing with Luther in the sense that it is God who justifies us, who redeems us, who saves us. It is God who does that. But our work, the way we do what we do, the penance, for example, the practices that we do, the novenas, etc., they help in a way to that doesn't help God, but when it helps us, the person himself would have that kind of assistance. Now, against the position of sola scriptura, according to the Council of Trent, scripture tradition is important, but it has to also consider what has developed since the time of the writing of the scriptures, which we call traditions. And the traditions are approved and interpreted by church authority, and not just by any one fulano or fulana or one individual person who reads the Bible. No, it has to be interpreted by the proper church authority. That is what the Council of Trent would how the Council of Trent would argue against sola scriptura only. Now, against the two sacraments, for example, of the Reformers, they only accepted baptism and the Eucharist, and the others are, well, very beautiful, pious activities, but they are not on the level of the sacraments because they were justifying it based on what they found in the New Testament. These are the only two things that where there was a direct kind of a command on the part of Jesus. Baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and then or whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven, and whose sins you lose, they are loose. Okay, so that is their position. So only two sacraments, but the Council of Trent says, following the tradition in the church, especially since the Middle Ages, there are seven sacraments in the church. Again, I already mentioned against the idea that the Mass was just simply a meal, as the Reformers have held. The Council of Trent would say Mass is not just a meal, but also a sacrifice. Okay, now, how about the idea of the church? What is the idea of the church according to the Council of Trent? What is the church like? Basically, the hierarchical model of church of the High Middle Ages. That is what they conceive the church to be. Actually, if you look at the document itself, it is the church as a perfect society. What they mean by perfect is hierarchically organized from the top to the bottom. That is their idea of perfection or the perfect society, a hierarchical model which is basically feudalistic. Okay, that's the model of the church in the High Middle Ages, which they tried to bring back to the Council of Trent, because that is something that is well, you can if you were a bishop, if you were a pope, would you argue against your own position? You would not argue against your own position because, well, your authority precisely is founded on that particular position. If you deny that position, then well, you're no longer the what do you call this? The authority. You don't have any more authority. So the structure is of power. The church was more a structure for power more than pastoral service. In other words, who has the final say here? The clerics were leaders and the authorities, whereas the laity were the subjects of the rulers. They are the ones who would obey whatever the leaders would say. Okay, so you are on the obeying part of the whole schema of things. Okay, you obey. We command, you obey. We teach, you learn from us. We minister, and eventually you, I'm delegating you to do certain jobs. So, but I have the authority. I have the power. I have been ordained to do this. So I have that power, and you, lay people, you would not have that. So different from 1,500 years ago in the time of the early Christian communities. Ministry. Some people like that kind of vestments there, that very colorful kind of vestments, the guitarra type of vestments. The medieval understanding of priesthood and ministry was carried on. by the Tridentine Church, which means emphasis on the cultic part and emphasis on the fact that you reach that point, you are able to be considered officially as a church minister by reason of being ordained. You are ordained to a state of life. So if you want to be a minister, then you have to study to become a minister, which is eventually studying in the seminary or studying under tutelage of a bishop or a priest, and then eventually you're recommended for ordination. Now, in regard to the sacramentality of order, there have been discussion about this, but I think it's important to again stress the fact that by and large, the Council of Trent made a distinction between ordained priesthood and the common priesthood. So the reformers asserted common priesthood for all baptized. Okay, and the Council of Trent says, yes, it's true, it's there, but there is a higher kind of a priesthood, which is over and above what we call the common priesthood, and that is the ordained priesthood. Okay, and the ordained priesthood is higher because it endows or it gives, it prints a particular character, sacramental character of ordination. And the reason, well, we will be discussing this about the character, sacramental character. But basically, the reason behind the idea of sacramental character is because once you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That's basically the perspective. Once you are ordained as a priest, and you will always be a priest. Even if you are no longer exercising your ministry, by and large, you are a priest. That character was saying that there was an ontological change in you, in your being. You have become a different person. Okay? the the reformers would always maintain we are all priests because we have received the common priesthood of all the baptized. Now, so with this idea of the superiority of ordained priesthood to the common priesthood, then necessarily the ordained priesthood is going to be preeminent because they are the leaders. They will be the leaders. And then further justification for this was that, the common priesthood was spiritual. Okay, everybody has that. It's a spiritual kind of a priesthood. While ordained priesthood was sacramental. What we're actually saying was that, okay, we are common priests, but the priesthood there is, a general idea of a priesthood. You're offering yourself as a sacrifice. So in a way, you are also a priest. That is also being priest. Okay. Whereas the ordained priesthood was really sacramental. That is, when we really talk about priesthood, that's the sacramental part. Okay. And that is why some of you are aspiring to become ordained priests, right? Right. But what happens here, of course, was that the whole idea of being ordained, previously it was when you were chosen as a leader, the community had a choice, had the option to choose you or reject you. But they had a say on who becomes a leader. So, but this time, the ordination is now decisive because it is not done with the approval of the community. It is only the bishop who approves. That's why people have that mentality. Unless you are called and ordained by the bishop, then you are not. You do not have vocation to the priesthood. You have to be called and ordained by the bishop to say that you have a vocation to the priesthood. Okay? So, for example, some women will say, "Oh, we would like to have to become priests also." But okay, if you use the mentality of the post-Tridentine, you would say, okay, unless you are called by the bishop and ordained by the bishop, then you cannot become a priest. So, and I don't know how many bishops would there be who would call and ordain women. So, practical purposes, that's going to be a hurdle that is would be difficult to surmount. Anyway, that's a perspective. Huh? It doesn't mean I agree with it, but it's a particular perspective. Okay, now, so the authority of the priest is acquired by ordination. So this is where we talk about the difference between potestas ordinis and potestas jurisdictionis. In other words, two kinds of power: the power by virtue of ordination and power by virtue of having jurisdiction. Now, jurisdiction is basically a canonical or a legal distinction. Order could be sacramental, it could also be a canonical and legal. But the jurisdiction is important because you may be ordained, but if you are not given the power or delegated power by the bishop, then you just remain ordained. You cannot hear confession, you cannot say mass because you are just ordained. So it means the bishop has to give you that power, the delegated power to celebrate the mass, celebrate the sacraments. Because without that, you cannot uh, you cannot function. So if you're a visiting priest, you're going to even your own diocese. If you have not been explicitly given authorization by the bishop, you're not supposed to say mass. Okay, but then the whole idea of ministry at this point would be the sacerdotalization of ministry. Now, ministry has been limited and further limited into what is happening in the Eucharistic celebration or in the excuse me, in the celebration of the sacraments, confession, for example, or baptism. So cultic ministry is ministry to offer sacrifice. Who is the person who offers in the most well, as close as possible to Christ's offering of his own sacrifice? It's the priest. That's why they will always say alter Christus. And the idea of alter Christus there is the idea of a cultic priest. Jesus Christ as the high priest, and we share, the ordained people share in the priesthood of Christ. So only those ordained by proper ecclesiastical authority can legitimately function as ministers of the sacrament. Those of you who are not ordained by the bishop, etchafera. Etchafera. Wala kayong karapatan. You don't have any right to. So, thus, there is now become the split between those who are ordained and those who are not ordained. In other words, the laity and the clergy. So there is growing division. Okay. So if you want to become powerful, you become a priest. If you want to be able to have certain status in life, you become a priest, not just ordinary lay people. Become a priest. It rings a bell, right? Okay. So here we were talking about ministry in the Tridentine Church, the principle of functionality is important. What do we mean by that? Functionality for the reformers means that the orders that you receive, for example, the ministries, what you call ministries that you receive, they are for actual service. You are given the ministry of preaching, so you preach. That's why there are some deacons and there are some deaconesses in some of the Protestant groups. Or you are given the ministry of visiting the sick, so you visit the sick. What happened in the Council of Trent, of course, was that these ministries were being part of the initial, what we would call, steps towards ordination to the priesthood. So, for example, a porter, a lector, an acolyte, an exorcist, a subdeacon, a deacon, and then, of course, the priest. So these are ministries that were there precisely only because they were the stepping stones towards the ordination to the priesthood. So, in other words, through a kind of installation to a particular type of ministry, little by little, the seminarian gets to know what are his responsibilities in regard to, let's say, opening the door of the church, yes, porter, or reading at Mass, yes, he has to learn how to read in Latin, or acolyte serving at Mass, or exorcising demons. You may have that gift, or what do you call this, serving at mass as a subdeacon, the one who is going to be assisting the priest and the deacon, and then eventually the deacon, etc., and then you become a priest. So they were just simply what he calls different steps towards. Actually, the focus or is the highlight is the or the apex, the climax is the ordination to the priesthood. All others are simply stepping stones. Whereas for the reformers, no, they are special charisms. Each one is the charism of a lector is a charism. Charism of an acolyte is a charism. Charism of exorcist is a different charism. Okay, so a different idea of ministry here. But according to the Council of Trent, well, you really do not have to make that kind of such a what I call it a literal interpretation of ministry, because in general we'd say the action of the church is effective, whether you are this minister or you are porter or a lector or what. It's the church that acts. It's the action of the church. That's the most important matter. You don't need to have the what do you call it. So and they carry that kind of a principle that it's the church that actually acts in the sacraments. They carried it to the extent that they were saying if it's the action of the church that ex opere operato, it grants a grace. It doesn't make difference whether the priest who was celebrating mass is a sinful priest. Why? His sinfulness does not affect the validity of the rite itself. That is the way of interpreting the ex opere operato. Okay. Now, what the Council of Trent also had done was to reform a little bit the idea of the bishops and the priests and their roles in regard to the parish and diocese. At this time, the Council of Trent insisted that the bishop, especially, would reside in his diocese. So you say, why? Did he reside somewhere else? Yes. There were some people who were made bishops and they were staying in the big city or like of Paris, but they are bishop of some place very far. But they are not what we call residential bishops. But what it means is that the income from the diocese goes to him, even if he is not residing in that diocese, goes to him. Because he's the bishop, he's been named as the bishop of that particular place. That was common before the Council of Trent, and the Council of Trent tried to tell them, you go back to your diocese and stay there as a resident. Same thing for priests. People were ordained, but they were ordained for a particular parish, but they actually were not doing pastoral work in that parish. But they are the what do you call this the valid the people who have been entrusted with that. So if there is any income coming from that parish, then it has to go to that priest, even if that priest is somewhere else in another big city. Okay. So according to the Council of Trent, the bishop and the priest who do not reside in their own diocese or their own parish will lose benefits if they neglected their pastoral duties. Okay. I don't know if you remember again when talking about Saint Vincent de Paul. What actually Saint Vincent de Paul was, he was looking for benefices. This is the kind of benefits that they were talking about. In other words, if you are named, you are going to be a parish priest of such and such a place, the income from that such and such a place goes to you. That is the benefits. That's the benefit. So even if you are assigned, so you are somewhere else, you can get the income. And it's possible that you are not just a parish priest in one parish, but you're also parish priest in several others. Economically, materially, it means you have all the income from those different parishes. So that is what Saint Vincent has been trying to, in his younger days, has been trying to look for benefices so that he could help his family. He would have income, be able to help his family, and in the process, maybe become a wealthy kind of a priest. Who knows? Maybe become a bishop later on. Now, another injunction that the Council of Trent had made for the bishop and the parish is to conduct parish visitation. Why? Were they not visiting? They were not. They were not. Why? They were busy doing other things. How about preaching of the word? Remember that the Protestants, based on the Bible, their idea of the Bible, he said we have to explain what is there in the Bible. Now, preaching of the word was encouraged also by the Council of Trent. This was something that was that was emphasized in some pre-Tridentine what do you call this regulations to preach the word. But now with the Protestants insisting on the preaching has to be on the Bible text, which is what we call now homily, the Bible text. The Council of Trent said, well, if we do that, then we are like the Protestants. So we will look like the Protestants. So let's do something else. So you give a sermon, and a sermon could be on any topic. Doesn't have to relate to the Bible. Doesn't have to relate to the scriptures. You're giving a sermon. I'm going to give you a sermon on what do you call this? The beatific vision during the fourth Sunday of Lent. Nothing to do with the readings, but I'm going to give you a sermon on the beatific vision. Okay. Sometimes, it's out of season. But anyway, I'm talking to talk to you about religious matters. Okay. So preaching of the word was emphasized by some, but they were frowned upon precisely because they made it look like Protestants. How about the role of the lay people? It is important to note that there was not a single session during the Council of Trent in the 20 years that it took the Council of Trent to finish its work that they devoted a session on the role of the lay people. Sino ba naman sila? Why will we worry about them? They don't have the power, so let's not worry about them. No session, no single session was ever used to discuss the role of the laity. And they were always defined. They were the non-cleric, they were the non-ordained with a passive role. They were not allowed to receive the chalice, they were not allowed to pray aloud and in their own language, which were all of these things were done by the Protestants. Protestants allowed the people to receive from the cup. They were invited to come and pray together with the rest of the community, whereas in the Catholic Church, it was only the priest who was saying everything. If you are going to attend there, then you bring your novenas and you bring your rosaries and pray in your own private way. But the priest is going to say his mass in Latin, do all the motions, go through all the motions, and be able to offer the sacrifice in your name. Okay, in your name, right? So there's now going to be a kind of a difference between the Protestant way of ministry and the Tridentine way of ministry. There's some kind of criticism on the Council of Trent.